y'all, it's me Tiffany and welcome back to my channel. If this is the first time you're here, I mostly do books, graphic novels, mangas. Occasionally I'll dabble into a television show or a movie, just not as frequently. So I haven't done a wrap up in a while. Ironically, the only two wrap ups I did were both January wrap ups. So I'm gonna do February through May, even though this is like in June that I'm recording this, just because that's easier. I was like, do I wait until June? I was like, no, because I'm starting to get out of that reading slump and I'm starting to read more, but I'm reading a lot of shorter stuff, so I don't know if it's just better for me to do that separate. Originally I was wanting to do like maybe a reading wrap up every other month, unless I just have a very heavy month. And then I got into a reading slump and I barely read anything in April and May. So I'm going to be pretty quick with the synopsis and my feelings on this because there's so many months. And while I do remember gist of things, I was just kind of in a weird headspace. And when I'm not in a weird headspace, I read a lot. So it's like, you know, this is a wrap up. This isn't dedicated reviews. If there's any dedicated reviews on anything that you see me add into this, let me know in the comments section below. Also, these aren't in the order that I'm necessarily reading them. Like if they're in a series or something like that, I kind of just combine them together and talk to them all like together. Kind of like if currently in June, I'm reading Invincible. So if I was to do a June wrap up, I would do volumes 1, 2, and 3, even if I read like a Sailor Moon in between 2 and 3, you know, just to make things easier. So let's jump into it. I do have the Clockwork Reader journal thing. I've made one or two videos where this is featured in it. This is just easier because, like, realistically, I can't remember everything perfectly. To be honest, like, I don't fill out the entire thing. I mostly just do that just because, what did you learn from the book? Your favorite quote, most memorable scene. Most of the time, I just don't care to fill that out. And sometimes I like, with this one, it's two different poetry books by the same author, so I just use them for the same page. I did do a few videos where I fill out a thing. I did the childhood favorites that I posted, but a lot of them came out blurry. So there's a few more that I'm thinking about doing. I just haven't done it yet. So the first one I want to talk about, I actually made a slight video on this. It's two different Alice Walker poetry books, and I read some of my favorite poems from the two books. The Absolute Trust in the Goddess of the Earth and Hard Times Require Furious Dancing. So, like I said, I did a video with my favorite ones, about 3 or 4 in each. This is my first exposure to Alice Walker. I have not read The Color Purple. She's done other things as well, which I have heard of The Color Purple. This is like a lot of classics. There's a ton of classics we've all heard of and just haven't got around to. It's definitely on a priority list, which I understand sometimes because you're a good novelist, you're not always a good poet, but sometimes you're both. So I definitely want to eventually get around to see. Oh, and I also want to say this. I was about to go on to the next one. I do think Alice Walker is more beginner friendly. If you are new to poetry, she writes more modernly, not as much like metaphors. There are metaphors, and it's not as simple as some like the Insta poetry, but it's not complicated either. So it's kind of a good in between. Okay, so the next one is a nonfiction called The 95 Thesis by Martin Luther. It actually has the 95 Thesis in the back, which I read before reading this book because I just didn't check the back to see if this was there. This is one of those impulse nonfiction reads when you're just reading through the library. And I've heard of Martin Luther before, just through history, stuff like that. I've taken a lot of history classes, but I never really focused that much on like the aspects of Christianity. But, you know, of course he has come up, you know, when you talk about Europe, things like that. Also, I was kind of raised Protestant, so, you know, the Lutheran Church, you know, I've heard the name, but I didn't know much about him. And the book that I mentioned, I think I also did in a tag. I guess it was technically a disappointing read because I thought it was going to be more about him or more about the day, and this was more of just like how researchers look on him, things like that. I mean, there are some stuff that are about him, but I feel like the information I was wanting from this book I didn't get. But I've actually read the 95 Thesis now, which is interesting because the whole Protestant, you know, revolution thing, without getting too much into. Okay, so the book, I said 95 Thesis because I put 95 Thesis by itself, but the actual nonfiction name is October 31st, 1517, the day the world changed. I guess I put 95 Thesis separate, even though it's in the back of the book, because like I said, I read it before reading the book, because typically, unless I'm purchasing a book, I'm just like, let me just go into this blindly. So sometimes I might look up a review, but I try to like not too much if I'm not paying for the book. So the next book is These Violet Delights. This is part of a Romeo and Juliet retelling video that I did. I read a few beforehand just because I knew I've read some in the past, but I wanted a couple more books, and I've seen this book like all over the internet and it looked interesting. It's based in China. Obviously Romeo and Juliet, so star-crossed lovers. This is like when China is getting invaded by a bunch of different people, including Russians, and I remember there being a monster in this. There's a lot of bloodshed. It's about gangs. It was really interesting, and I listened to this through audiobook, and I remember the narrator being really good. And I believe there's a second book called Our Violent Ends. And then when I was like looking up that, because I was thinking about reading it and I just haven't yet. I think there's like a Christmas special. Haven't read that, but yeah. Okay, so Asador volumes 1 through 4. I do not know if volume 5 is out in English yet or not. I'm sure they're further along in Japan. That's usually how these things go, especially I don't think this series is particularly popular. Maybe there's a bigger fan base than I know. But at least in my group, I have not seen anybody talk about this and nobody knew what I was talking about. So I read volumes 1 through 4, because that's what my library had. And some reason the cover art just really intrigued me with like the plane and stuff. So it takes place like during the war. And it starts really far back, and then there's a monsoon, and they see a monster, and this homeless man wants to kidnap her, and he changes his heart because he was just like desperate, and then realizes this is not what he wants to go through. And then when basically everything got wiped out, I believe a few of her siblings were saved. She comes from a huge family, and her mom was like just had a baby or was going into labor during this. They fly over, they drop baby supplies. So she ends up moving in with a shopkeeper years and years later, an older lady. And she works there, but you know, she's also kind of like, I guess like an auntie or something like that. That kind of relationship, you know, she kind of nags on her and stuff like that, but she don't really act like a full-on like stepmother either. And people are starting to discover the same monster that her and the pilot guy, I can't remember what his name was, discovered, and they realized, oh, you've seen these. And at this point, it skips ahead into the future. Like each book, she actually ages, which is really nice, because sometimes like the stories are all condensed in one little area, or it's flashbacks. And you know, it's just a mix of that. And she wants to become a pilot because of that day. She was like, ooh, I really like planes. And the guy that, you know, ended up kidnapping her, he's still in her life. He was a pilot, I believe, in World War II. So it's interesting, and I want the next one. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I read them all back to back. The artwork was kind of like, okay, but the story was great. And I need to see if there's the next one. Okay, so the next one is Silk by Maureen Gu. I've honestly read this because of Maureen Gu. I know I haven't read every book that Maureen Gu has come out with, but I've read like 3 of them that I really liked. I'll put them on the side. And I was like, let me see. I haven't read the original Silk by Spider-Man. I know she's not as popular as some of the other versions, particularly Miles. Like, it's probably about as popular as Peter Parker. But I like this. The artwork was okay. I believe the following issues are not going to be by Maureen Gu. I've been meaning to go back and read the Maureen Gu I haven't read, but it's been years since I've read Maureen Gu, and I just like her writing style. Sometimes authors who go into comics, things like that, particularly DC or Marvel comics, they don't translate the medium as well, but I think she did fine. Indie obviously sometimes is a struggle, but I feel like they shine harder when they transfer to like indie, because they have more things they are allowed to do, you know, and Marvel and DC are kind of like, we want this kind of thing, especially with an established character. But I think she did fine, and I thought the story was okay. So I read The Complete Mouse. I showed in another video, I got the one where it's like volume 1 and volume 2 because that's all I could find, because people were scalping it, which they scalp everything, you know, that's just how life's been. Like, I mean, I know scalping happened before the illness has gone around, but it's definitely heightened up a lot. And there was a school district that banned it. There's actually a lot of stuff going on with school districts, but I'm not going to get into that in this video. I have seen it before. I always thought, like, I'm going to read this, you know, I think it'd be interesting. I hadn't read any Holocaust graphic novels, things like that, especially, it's not like historical fiction. It's actually a telling of his father's journey, and then like basically him and how he's navigated and grew up with Holocaust survivors, and his mother's unliving herself. I don't know if the word's actually allowed to be said on YouTube. His stepmom is also a survivor. So it's interesting, you know, how, you know, and then it's kind of like survivor's guilt between him and some other people he knows whose parents were also survivors. And it talks about some of the aftermath. And I thought it was interesting. The artwork reminds me kind of like old newspaper type comics, which this is an older graphic novel, but I kind of like that, you know, instead of it being flashy. And I don't read a lot of really old graphic novels, but, you know, so it was nice to see that kind of style. It doesn't hold back. You know, he tells his truth in it, even when he was questioning whether he's right or wrong for making a book and possibly making money off this. So it was interesting. I did read this because of the controversy. It was on my radar before then, but it definitely pushed it. Thankfully, I did not have to pay an inflated price. My local comic guy sold it to me for retail price, so I'm thankful for that. Like, he actually had him in the back, and he's not a big fan on scalping. So, you know, I don't know if he was trying to keep that from happening or whatever, but shout outs to him. Fragments of Horror was the first book I had read in a while, and a lot of his stories, you know, he has some that are collected in a little book, and then I think he has 1 or 2 series, and then a lot of his stuff's kind of like short stories, anthologies, things like that. This one is that. I needed this at the time. I was in a really bad mental space. I was in a really bad reading slump. Like, it was bad enough that I had to read each story twice, but I got through it. And I actually did enjoy them the second time. It was just, sometimes it's not that the story is bad. It's just your brain's foggy. There's a lot going on. I was also going through new experiences, or I hadn't been working in the public in a long time. I've been doing everything from home. So even though like I enjoy a lot what I do, sometimes if you've just been isolated for so long, it takes a while to get used to being around people. So all your mental strength goes there. And I'm just, but I really enjoyed it. I'm happy that it's kind of, not to be out of the reading slump. I mean, I wasn't reading back to back to back after this, but it kind of helped push me in that direction. So, and I have another one. I always want to read everything he comes out with. I just don't always get a chance. You know, he's rather popular, and I usually do library books. I have his version of Frankenstein checked out. So hopefully I get to that soon. Sometimes I don't read them when I get them from the library, but I try to. So that's the important part. This is not the one that I read. I just brought this over here. So I live in Hawaii, and they have schools that are meant for Native Hawaiians, things like that. And these are children books, and they're historical books. I read the first 4. I don't think it matters if you read them in order, because they're all on a bit different, like monarch, because there was a monarchy here for, I think, 90 years. And this is a children's book. I haven't read this one, but, you know, they're light read, whatever. But since I knew basically nothing about Hawaii, I definitely want to, if I'm going to live here, I definitely want to learn more about the history and stuff like that. So I thought this was a good way to get an intro into the different monarchs, stuff like that, because they're still celebrated here. You know, it's part of their history and their culture. And So it's very light and meant for children. And I've been reading through them. I read through the first 4. I haven't read the 5th one. This is number 6, but this was what was available. And I'm not like binging them, but once I get through some of these or what's available, I definitely want to read a more condensed book and build my way up instead of just jumping into a heavily condensed Hawaiian history book. I thought this would be a nice way to get some introduction to some of the big highlights in history, then go into more details. And I've enjoyed it. There's a lot of stuff I did not expect. There was a lot of stuff that I've heard, random stuff just being around locals and things like that. And it's, you know, I mean, I've looked stuff up when a name or a term comes up a lot, but there's just some stuff, you know, that, you know, I just haven't, and it's making some stuff make sense. And like, I know Hawaii has a complicated history with the United States, but this is when Hawaii was just like Hawaii. So yeah, I'm definitely glad that they have these readily available. It's made the introduction a little bit easier to get into. And like I said, eventually I want to get into a book that goes into a lot more detail. But there's 7 of these, and they're in English and the Hawaiian language. So I think that's cool. Oh, so I know this isn't like a review on the Clockwork Readers reading journal, but I filled them out to the point where I got here. I mean, I would have gotten here sooner if I did every single page. Every single book had its own page, but like even like that last one, I just put them all, and I used some of that empty space to write things about them individually. But yeah, I just wanted to show that. I think it's nice. So I also read another children's book. Lately, I've actually had to read a good bit of children's books. It's just something to do with like my job and stuff like that. And this one's Hiroshima. This is I was just curious, it was sitting there. I didn't actually have to read this one. And I was curious how the bombings were taught in a children's book. Like, you know, younger, we talked about World War II, things like that, and we knew the bomb happened, but a dedicated book for kids, I was just curious how it went. And I think it got most of the point across, but it was still comprehensible for children. And I never knew about the paper cranes thing, and like with the little girls. So I've been meaning to read more about it. It made like a light mention of it, and I looked it up. Oh, that's like interesting, you know? So I've been meaning to look more into that. I just haven't yet. I have read 2 Amanda Lovelace poetry books, Flower, Crowns, and Fearsome Things, and Unlock Your Story Hearts. Amanda Lovelace is somebody I enjoy. A lot of times with these Insta poets, I don't really like that term, but everybody knows what I mean when I say that. Yeah, I don't like every single thing they come out with, and I think some of it would make more sense if it got marketed as a stream of consciousness or a dump book. But at the same time, I do think some of them do have like poetry elements, things like that. And who am I to say that somebody's personal experience is a poem or not a poem? You know, it's just things like that. And it's a new medium, new stuff. But I'm not going to be like this elitist person, be like, well, you're not writing like Emily Dickinson, so what you say is stupid. Like, no. And I think like a lot of this stuff is great, especially for younger people. And like I've read all of her stuff through the library, so I haven't spent any money. But like her and Rupi Kaur, I do think there's some gems in there, and I do enjoy them when I read them. You know, and do I think they're the best ever? No. But at this point, I think I've read every single poetry book Amanda Lovelace has came out with. Same with Rupi Kaur. So when the library gets them, I'm just naturally like, oh, let me just read the next one because I'm already here. But I will say this, I do like the artwork quality that the recent Amanda Lovelace's poetry books have had. Like some of them are full pages now instead of just like the simplistic drawings that some of them have, which I don't mind those, but yeah, you know, it's fun. I read 3 children's books, The Bad Seed, Fox and Socks, I Want My Hat Back. Oh, and I didn't put this on here. I don't know. Yeah, those are the 3 I read. Sorry. I was thinking about something I read like last week. So, you know, I mean, I'm not going to go straight into like critiquing. These are like young children's books, like early beginner, big text. I Want My Hat Back was actually recommended by a friend because it's kind of bleak, and they thought it was funny, and I did too. You know, the ending just made me kind of laugh, and it was a nice little chuckle. And then Fox and Socks and The Bad Seed were something I had to basically had to do something with the book, and so I had to read through the book, and I was like, I'm not getting paid for this. I can mark down whatever I want, so I did. They were fine. So this actually was a book I read before these books, but I wanted to throw this at the end. The Rise and Fall of the Dinosaurs. It took me a couple weeks to read this. So I actually purchased this book brand new. I typically don't do that. Usually when I buy books, they're usually used. And if they're not, you know, like Ellen Hopkins books, or like when I'm buying the new edition of the Sailor Moons, like those aren't used. But I almost never write in books. The only time I really have is like academically, and when I did, I usually do pencil and I lightly write, and then I have a page that's like you know, loose leaf paper of me like, go to this page, this is why I did this, and that's usually like if I need quotes and stuff, and then I erase it. But granted, most books I don't buy, most of them were library, so maybe that's why. I wrote and analyzed the crap out of this book. This is a nonfiction book. I've never read anything about dinosaurs. I actually wasn't taught anything about dinosaurs. Actually, the environment I was in told me my entire life dinosaurs weren't real, and all that was a lie. And that was school, church, like basically everybody, and that was just the environment I'm in. Not everybody from where I'm from believes that, but my particular, I wouldn't say sub-community, but just, you know, my little bubble as a kid believed this way. So I knew nothing. Like, I don't know anything about early humans, early dinosaurs. I've seen stuff about the asteroid mentioned, you know, like stuff like the Big Bang Theory, like the television show. Sometimes they're referenced in cartoons. I did watch The Land Before Time. You know, sometimes they're like, oh, when the asteroid came, blah, 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 and they go on to the next thing, right? So that's all I knew. So I decided I wanted to learn stuff that I was lied to about as a kid. And this one was a very popular book, and I understood most of it. There was some stuff I had to look up, like there was just some stuff I genuinely didn't know, and I don't know if they were taught in public schools that were different than mine. I don't know. You know what I mean? I just don't know. I just weren't taught it. So sometimes I'd stop, read things, you know, and I laughed when they would like point out like how Jurassic Park was wrong, because I did watch those. And eventually I would love to reread this when I get a little bit more knowledge, or let it set in instead of, because like I can't remember everything because everything was so new, but some of it goes through his experience as I forgot what the word is, the person who studies the dinosaur, and then the actual history of the dinosaurs, and it goes through different decades. Like, I didn't realize Jurassic was a very small period of dinosaurs. I did have one biology class in college that mentioned birds and alligators who were like basically dinosaurs and whales, but it was a very brief thing. You know, it was a very like passing thing, and we went on to the next thing with cells. So it never went into detail. So I just knew nothing. And me trying, it's just, without me getting too deep into like my philosophy and all this stuff, it's just, I just wanted to learn something that I was told never happened, and it kind of obviously did. And I didn't want something that was way too scientific, because I'm just not that knowledgeable in science, and I'm not a super science person. So the fact this is written more like a history book, and there was science stuff to it, it's like, no, hey, we saw this, this, and this, but he also explained what it mean, but he didn't make you feel dumb when he explained what it mean. Since I wrote so much through this book, I'm thinking about doing a flip through of my what is it called? You know what I'm trying to say, like just all the writings and stuff like that. I know the actual word, I just can't think of it right now. I see people saying like, oh, how I annotate. Yeah, how I annotate my books. Or sometimes I see a flip through. I thought about doing it with this. I won't show any pages that I like this one very quickly. I'm not going to sit there and zoom in on pages I haven't wrote into because I can't show the whole book legally. But I thought about just showing the stuff you know, all the stuff I've written, because some of them I wrote a huge note, some of them I underlined things. So I thought that'd be fun. I don't know if I'm going to do it or not, but I had so much fun doing that, and I have never done that in a book. So not only was I was like claiming knowledge that I was denied from, but I never just like basically torn up a book, except for maybe when I was really, really young, but not for this. And eventually, like I said, I want to read through this. I even wrote a note about the first time I read it and my thoughts, because it's just so much information. I thought about watching a documentary. I just haven't yet. I'm just letting this sit. There's just so much new knowledge. So yeah, I wanted to say this to the end because I wanted to talk about this more. I'm probably going to keep this book forever. So guys, that is it. Have you read any of these books before? Is there anything you would like me to go into deeper details about? And if you're into wrap-ups, do you like monthly wrap-ups better than a bunch of months put together? Or how do you like it, you know? I think I've done one where it's like every book I read for like one half of the year, or every book I read in a year. I can't really remember, but I've only done 2 monthly wrap-ups ever, and for some reason they were both January. I've read a lot more shorter books in the month of June already, but I don't know if I'm going to do a June wrap-up or a June and July wrap-up. We shall see. It just, I guess, depends on what other kind of content that I want to make. So now I'm actually going to go. I'll see you later, guys. Bye.